The police cruiser's lights painted red and blue shadows across Marcus's driveway as Officer Reynolds stepped out, his hand resting on his radio. Behind her pristine white fence, Karen Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing. At her lips, as she watched the chaos unfold, what she didn't know was that the pool removal she'd just reported as suspicious activity was about to expose a 20-year-old secret buried 6 feet beneath the concrete one that would turn her perfect suburban life into a nightmare she never saw coming. The concrete saw screamed to life at exactly 7 a.m., its diamond blade biting through the pool deck with surgical precision. Marcus Chen adjusted his safety goggles and leaned into the machine, guiding it along the chalk line he'd drawn the night before. 20 years of California sun had bleached the concrete nearly white, but now it cracked and crumbled like old bones beneath the relentless blade. "Jesus, Marcus, you're really doing this," his brother Danny called over the noise. Hauling another chunk of broken concrete toward, the dumpster, sweat already beaded on his forehead, despite the early morning chill. "Mom's going to lose her mind when she finds out." Marcus killed the saw and wiped his face with the back of his gloved hand. "Mom's been gone for 3 years, Danny, and this thing's been nothing but a money pit since Dad died." He gestured toward the empty pool, its once blue tiles now stained brown with algae and neglect. "You know what it costs to maintain? The chemicals, the pump repairs? I'm hemorrhaging money I don't have." Danny dropped his end of the concrete slab with a grunt. "But it's not just about the money, is it? This is about Jessica." The name hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, the familiar twist of grief and rage coiling in his chest. Jessica, his daughter, gone 18 months now, and he still couldn't walk past the pool without seeing her 8-year-old face breaking the surface, laughing as she called for him to watch her newest dive. "Don't," Marcus said quietly. "Just don't." But Danny pressed on, his voice gentler now. "She loved this pool, man. Remember her birthday parties, the way she'd beg us to keep the lights on so she could swim at night? You're erasing her memory." "I'm not erasing anything," Marcus's voice cracked, despite his efforts to keep it steady. "I'm trying to survive." "You think I want to wake up every morning and see the place where he stopped, shaking his head? I can't do this anymore, Danny. I can't live with it staring at me." The accident had been ruled exactly the Tan accident, a faulty pool. Drain a 6-year-old's curiosity, and 30 seconds that changed everything. The lawsuits were settled, the safety violations addressed, but none of that brought Jessica back. Her mother, Sarah, had moved to Portland within a month, unable to bear the sight of the house, the pool, or Marcus himself. Some grief, she'd said, was too big for love to survive. Danny started to respond, but a sharp voice cut through the morning air. "Excuse me, excuse me." Both brothers turned toward the chain-link fence that separated Marcus's property from his neighbor's immaculate yard. Karen Whitmore stood there in her bathrobe and slippers, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She clutched a cordless phone in one manicured hand and held a steaming coffee mug in the other. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This noise is absolutely unacceptable. It's barely 7 in the morning." Marcus had been avoiding this conversation for weeks, knowing it was inevitable. Karen Whitmore had lived next door for 12 years, and in that time, she'd filed complaints about everything from his garbage cans being out too early to his sprinklers hitting her fence. She ran the homeowners association with an iron fist and seemed to take personal offense at any deviation from her vision of suburban perfection. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus called, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I'm removing the pool. I got all the permits." "Permits?" Karen's voice rose an octave. "You can't just tear up your backyard without proper notice. This affects property values, the neighborhood aesthetic, the noise, the dust, the trucks. The permits are posted." "Right there on the fence," Danny interrupted, pointing to the weathered documents zip-tied to the chain link. "Everything's legal." Karen squinted at the papers, her mouth pursing in disappointment. "Well, that doesn't make it right. This is a family neighborhood, Marcus. People invested here because of the community standards, the way things are maintained. You can't just destroy things because you feel like it." Marcus felt something dark and hot rising in his chest. "Destroy things. This is my property, Mrs. Whitmore. My pool, my yard, my choice. Your choices affect all of us," she shot back. That pool has been part of this neighborhood for decades. Your parents put it in when houses here actually meant something. Now, you want to tear it out like some common trailer park. Enough." Marcus's voice was quiet, but something in his tone made Karen take a step back. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know that ever since your ... troubles, this whole property has gone downhill. The landscaping, the paint, the way you barely maintain my troubles." Marcus stepped toward the fence, his hands clenched at his sides. "Is that what you call losing my daughter?" Karen's face flushed, but she pressed on. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm talking about responsibility, community standards, the way things are supposed to be done." Danny moved closer. To his brother, recognizing the warning signs, Marcus had always been the calm one, the peacemaker, but grief had changed him. These days, his temper ran close to the surface, and Karen Whitmore had just crossed a line she didn't even know existed. "Mrs. Whitmore," Danny said carefully, "we're sorry about the noise, but we're working within legal hours. The job should be done by this afternoon." "This afternoon?" Karen's voice cracked with indignation. "You're planning to do this all day? The concrete dust? The diesel fumes from that equipment? I have guests coming for lunch, and the Patterson wedding is tomorrow evening. This is completely unacceptable." Marcus started the concrete saw again without another word. The blade bit into the deck with renewed fury, sending chips of concrete flying. The message was clear. The conversation was over. Karen stood at the fence for another moment, her face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and something that looked almost like fear. Then she turned and marched back toward her house, the phone already pressed to her ear. "She's calling?" "Someone," Danny observed over the noise. Marcus didn't respond. He was lost in the rhythm of destruction, watching 20 years of family memories crumble beneath his blade. Each cut brought him closer to something he couldn't name, not closure exactly, but maybe a kind of emptiness that would hurt less than the constant reminder of what he'd lost. The work continued through the morning. A crew of day laborers arrived at 8, followed by a mini excavator that made quick work of the pool's concrete shell. By noon, the backyard looked like a war zone. The pristine blue rectangle that had dominated the space for 2 decades was reduced to a gaping hole filled with rebar and broken concrete. Marcus stood at the edge of the excavation, breathing hard. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and dust clung to every exposed inch of skin. But for the first time in months, he felt something that might have been peace. Boss called Miguel, the crew foreman. "We got a problem." Marcus looked up from his contemplation of the destruction. Miguel was standing near the deep end of the former pool, his face pale beneath his hard hat. The other workers had stopped their cleanup and were staring at the same spot. "What kind of problem?" Marcus asked, but even as the words left his mouth, he could see what had caught their attention. The excavator's bucket had torn through more than just concrete and rebar. At the bottom of the deep end, partially exposed by the machine's work, something dark and unnatural protruded from the earth. Fabric. Old, stained, but unmistakably fabric. "Shit," Danny whispered, moving to Marcus's side. "Is that ... Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands, his eyes still fixed on the dark shape in the dirt. The caller ID showed Karen Whitmore's Didn't answer. Almost, "Yeah, Marcus Chen." The voice wasn't Karen's. It was male, professional, with a kind of authority that made civilian spines straighten automatically. "This is Officer Reynolds with the Santa Monica Police Department. I'm responding to a complaint about suspicious activity at your address. I'm going to need you to stop what you're doing and come speak with me." Marcus looked at the hole in his backyard, at the dark fabric that shouldn't have been there, at the growing crowd of workers who were starting to understand that they'd stumbled onto something much worse than a simple pool removal. Through the fence, he could see Karen Whitmore standing in her perfectly manicured garden, still in her bathrobe, still holding her phone. She was watching the chaos with the satisfaction of someone who believed justice was being served. She had no idea that her call to the police had just exposed a secret that would destroy not just Marcus's life, but potentially her own officer. "Reynolds," Marcus said into the phone, his voice barely steady, "I think you're going to want to see this." Officer Reynolds arrived within 12 minutes, his patrol car's presence immediately drawing the attention of every neighbor within a 3-block radius. Marcus watched from his front porch as Karen Whitmore emerged from her house, now fully dressed in one of her signature pastel cardigans, her face wearing the smug expression of someone whose complaint had been taken seriously. She had no idea she was about to become the prime suspect in a murder investigation. Mr. Chen Reynolds was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 35, with a kind of lean build that suggested he took the physical requirements of his job seriously. His dark eyes swept over the construction chaos in the backyard before settling on Marcus. "I understand you've discovered something unusual during your renovation." "That's putting it mildly," Marcus replied, leading the officer. "Through the side gate, we were breaking up the pool deck when the excavator hit something that definitely shouldn't be there." The worksite had transformed into an impromptu crime scene. Miguel had ordered his crew to step back from the excavation, and they now clustered near their trucks, speaking in hushed Spanish and stealing glances at the hole. Danny stood guard near the edge of the pit, his face pale with the understanding that their family's morning demolition project had just become something far more serious. Reynolds approached the excavation carefully, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. The excavator's final pass had revealed more than just fabric. A human skull, yellowed with age and partially crushed, protruded from the disturbed earth. Skeletal remains were scattered throughout the dig site, some still partially buried, others exposed by the machine's relentless bucket. What made the scene even more disturbing was the clear evidence that this wasn't an accidental burial. The body had been wrapped in what appeared to be a plastic tarp, and the positioning suggested it had been placed deliberately in the deep end before the pool's construction. "Jesus Christ," Reynolds breathed, immediately reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. I need the coroner and a crime scene team at 1247 Oakwood Drive immediately. We have human remains." The radio crackled with confirmations and questions, but Marcus barely heard them. His mind was reeling, trying to process the implications of what they'd found. Someone had been buried beneath his family's pool for 20 years. Someone had been murdered, wrapped in plastic, and hidden under tons of concrete while he and Jessica had swum above their grave. Mr. Chen Reynolds said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official business. "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you have any knowledge of these remains?" "Of course not," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse with shock. "How could I? The pool's been here since 2004. My parents had it installed when they bought the house." "And your parents are?" "Dead. Dad died 5 years ago. Mom, 3 years after that." Marcus felt Danny's hand on his shoulder, a steadying presence as the world tilted around them. "They never said anything about ... about this." Reynolds made notes in his small pad, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered beyond the fence. Karen Whitmore had positioned herself at the front of the group, her expression shifting from satisfaction to growing alarm as she overheard fragments of the police radio chatter. "The pool construction," Reynolds continued. "Do you have records of who did the work? Permits? Contractor information?" Danny stepped forward. "I might be able to help with that. Dad kept all the house records in his office. Receipts, permits, warranties, everything." "I'll need to see those," Reynolds said, then looking directly at Marcus. "Right now, this is being treated as a crime scene. Nobody else goes near that excavation until the coroner and forensics teams have processed everything. Understood?" Marcus nodded, but his attention was drawn to movement beyond the fence. Karen Whitmore was no longer standing with the other neighbors. She was walking quickly toward her house, her phone pressed to her ear, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said slowly, "the neighbor who called you Mrs. Whitmore, she's been here longer than anyone. If you're looking for people who might remember the pool construction... Reynolds followed Marcus's gaze and watched Karen disappear into her house. "How long has she lived here? 12 years? Maybe 13? She moved in a few years after the pool was finished, but she knows everything that happens in this neighborhood. Everything." The crime scene team arrived like a small army. The coroner's van, 2 additional patrol cars, a forensics unit, and Detective Sarah Martinez, whose reputation for closing cold cases preceded her wherever she went. Martinez was a 20-year veteran with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at the excavation and immediately began issuing orders. "I want photos of everything before we move a single bone," she called to the forensics photographer. "Then we grid the entire area. This looks like it's been here for decades, so we're going to take our time and do this right." She approached Marcus with the measured gait of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "Mr. Chen, I'm Detective Martinez. I know this is difficult, but I need to understand exactly how this discovery was made." Marcus walked her through the morning's events, his decision to remove the pool, the permit process, the early morning start, to avoid complaints from neighbors. He explained about Jessica, about the accident, about his inability to continue living with the constant reminder of his loss. Martinez listened without interruption, her face neutral but her eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that made guilty people confess secrets they'd sworn to take to their graves. "The timing of your pool removal," she said when he'd finished, "was this planned in advance, or was it a recent decision?" "Recent," Marcus admitted. "I've been thinking about it since Jessica died, but I only made the final decision about 3 weeks ago. Got the permits, hired the crew, ordered the dumpster." "And you didn't discuss this with anyone? Neighbors, friends, family members?" Danny spoke up. "He told me about a month ago that he was thinking about it, but we didn't really talk details." Until this week, Martinez made notes, then looked toward Karen Whitmore's house. "The neighbor who called in the complaint, Mrs. Whitmore, how did she react when you told her about the pool removal?" "She was furious," Marcus said, "kept talking about property values and community standards. She seemed to take it personally, like I was doing it just to spite her." "Has she ever mentioned the original pool construction? Any stories about the previous owner's unusual activity during the installation?" Marcus shook his head, but something nagged at him. A memory from years ago, something Karen had said during one of their many fence line disputes, something about the house's history, about problems with previous contractors. "Wait," he said slowly, "there was something. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we were arguing about my landscaping, and she made some comment about how the house had always been trouble. She said something about the pool installation being a nightmare, workers coming and going at all hours, machinery running late into the night." Martinez's pen stopped moving. "She said that about the pool installation being unusual." "Yeah, but I figured she was just complaining. Karen complains about everything." The detective's expression hardened. "Mr. Chen, I need you to stay available for further questions. Don't leave town, and don't discuss this case with anyone beyond immediate family." She looked toward Karen's house, where the curtains were now drawn tight against prying eyes. "I think it's time I had a conversation with Mrs. Whitmore." As Martinez walked toward Karen's front door, the coroner's team began the delicate process of extracting the remains from their 20-year grave. Each bone was photographed, cataloged, and carefully placed in evidence bags. The skull, partially crushed but still intact enough for identification, told a story of violence that made the construction workers cross themselves and look away. Marcus stood at the edge of his destroyed backyard, watching strangers excavate a murder victim from beneath the place where his daughter had learned to swim. The irony was so brutal, it felt like a physical blow. He'd been trying to escape the memory of Jessica's death, only to discover that she'd been playing above someone else's grave for her entire short life. Danny moved to stand beside him. "You okay?" "No," Marcus said simply. "I don't think I'll ever be okay again." Across the yard, Detective Martinez knocked on Karen Whitmore's door. Through the window, they could see Karen peeking through the curtains, her face pale and frightened. The door opened just a crack, and Martinez showed her badge. What happened next made Marcus's blood run cold. Karen Whitmore looked directly at Detective Martinez and said, in a voice loud enough to carry across both yards, "I've been expecting you for 20 years. Then she opened the door wide and stepped back, her hands already reaching toward the sky in the universal gesture of surrender. The perfectly manicured suburban housewife who had spent over a decade terrorizing her neighbors about property values and community standards had just confessed to murder. Detective Martinez didn't move for a full 10 seconds, her hand still raised to knock on a door that had already opened. Karen Whitmore stood in her doorway like a woman stepping out of a 20-year nightmare, her perfectly styled silver hair catching the afternoon light, her pastel cardigan buttoned with the same precision she'd maintained for over a decade of living a lie. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martinez said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of experience with confessions that came to isolate. "I think we should talk inside." Karen nodded and stepped back, but her eyes remained fixed on Marcus across the yard. There was something in her expression, not guilt exactly, but a kind of terrible relief, as if a burden she'd carried for 2 decades was finally being lifted from her shoulders. Marcus felt Danny grab his arm. "Did she just—" "Yeah," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the crime scene team working behind them. "She did." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Additional police units arrived, followed by news vans and curious neighbors who clustered at the edges of the police tape that now cordoned off both properties. Marcus found himself sitting in the back of an ambulance, not because he was injured, but because Detective Martinez thought he looked like he might collapse. Through Karen's front window, he could see her sitting at her dining room table, her hands folded in her lap, while Martinez took notes. Occasionally, Karen would gesture toward Marcus's house, and once, Martinez turned to look directly at him, a young officer appeared at his elbow. "Detective Martinez would like to speak with you." Marcus walked into Karen Whitmore's house for the first time in 12 years of being neighbors. The interior was exactly what he'd expected: pristine, sterile, decorated in muted pastels with family photos that showed Karen with a husband and daughter who had never visited in all the years he'd lived next door. Karen looked up when he entered, and Marcus was shocked by what he saw. The imperious, controlling woman who had made his life miserable for over a decade was gone. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I'm so sorry about Jessica, about all of this. You have to understand, I never meant for any of this to happen. Mrs. Whitmore has been telling me about the summer of 2004, about the pool construction and what happened during that time." Karen's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. His name was Tommy Valdez. He was one of the pool contractors. A young man, maybe 25. He was stealing from the job site. Tools, materials, anything he could sell. Marcus felt his world tilt again. "You killed someone for stealing construction materials." "No," Karen's voice cracked. "No, it wasn't like that. Tommy wasn't just stealing supplies. He was ... He found something." "In my garage?" She stopped, looking toward the window where crime scene techs were still working in Marcus's backyard. "You have to understand what my life was like then. I'd just moved here after my divorce. I was trying to start over, be someone new. But David, my ex-husband, he wouldn't let me go." Martinez leaned forward. "David was your ex-husband?" Karen nodded. "David Whitmore. Other things, the restraining order didn't matter to him. The police couldn't do anything until he actually hurt me, and by then it would have been too late." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The night it happened, David had been drinking. He broke into the house, said he was going to kill me, and then himself. We fought in the kitchen. He had a knife. I grabbed the marble rolling pin from the counter, and ... and I hit him. Just once, but it was enough." Marcus stared at her. "You killed your ex-husband in self-defense," Karen said quickly. "But who was going to believe me? David was charming, well-connected. I was the bitter ex-wife who'd stolen half his assets in the divorce. I panicked. I wrapped his body in tarps and hid it in the garage while I figured out what to do. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than Marcus could have imagined." "Tommy found the body," he said. Karen nodded. He'd been stealing tools from the garage. One night, he moved the wrong tarp and he saw David. Instead of calling the police, he tried to blackmail me. $50,000, or he'd tell everyone. I was a murderer. "So you killed him too?" "I didn't mean to." Karen's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We were arguing in the backyard. The pool excavation was finished, but they hadn't poured the concrete yet. Tommy was drunk, screaming, threatening to call the police, right? Then, if I didn't give him the money, he grabbed me, shook me, and I pushed him away. He fell backwards, hit his head on the edge of the excavation. The sound, ... God, the sound it made." Detective Martinez made careful notes. "And then he was dead. I checked for a pulse, tried CPR, but there was nothing. I sat there for hours, trying to figure out what to do. Then I realized ... The workers weren't supposed to be back until then. Marcus felt sick. You buried him in the pool. I wrapped him in the same tarps I'd used for David. dragged him into the deep end, and covered him with dirt from the landscaping pile. When the concrete crew arrived the next morning, they just poured over everything. No one ever knew what about David. Karen wiped her eyes with a tissue. I cut him up, piece by piece, over several weeks. I put the pieces in garbage bags and threw them away on trash day, just a little at a time. It took 3 months to dispose of everything. Marcus tried to process what he'd just heard. For 12 years, he'd lived next door to a woman who had killed 2 men and disposed of their bodies with the cold efficiency of someone disposing of household waste. The complaints? Marcus said suddenly. All these years, every little thing. I did that bothered you. You were trying to control everything because you were terrified someone would find out. Karen nodded miserably. Every time you talked about pool maintenance, every time workers came to your house, every time there was any kind of excavation or construction, I was terrified. I convinced myself that if I could just keep everything perfect, keep everyone following the rules, no one would have any reason to dig or investigate or ask questions. And when I decided to remove the pool, I knew it was over. Karen said simply, 20 years of living in fear, and it was finally over. Part of me was relieved when you told me what you were planning. I called the police this morning, not to stop you, but because I knew Tommy would be found, and I couldn't live with the secret anymore. Detective Martinez closed her notebook. Mrs. Whitmore, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Valdez and the unlawful disposal of human remains in the death of David Whitmore. She began reading the Miranda rights while Karen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, like a schoolchild waiting for dismissal. As they led Karen away in handcuffs, she stopped in front of Marcus. I know this doesn't mean anything now, but I am truly sorry about Jessica. She was a beautiful little girl, and she deserved so much better than than all of this. Marcus watched the patrol car disappear down the street, carrying away the woman who had made his life miserable for over a decade, who had unknowingly been his daughter's playmate above a grave, who had killed 2 men and lived with the secret for 20 years. Danny appeared at his side. So what happens now? Marcus looked at his backyard, where the crime scene team was still working under floodlights as the sun began to set. Tomorrow, there would be more questions, more investigators, more reporters. The story would spread through the neighborhood, the city, probably the entire country, the suburban housewife who killed her ex-husband in self-defense, then murdered a blackmailer and buried him under a family swimming pool. But tonight, for the first time in 18 months, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: peace. Not because Karen Whitmore had been arrested, not because justice had been served, but because he finally understood something fundamental about grief and guilt and the terrible weight of secrets. A tragic, preventable accident that had nothing to do with the evil buried beneath the water where she'd learned to swim. Her death was pure, innocent. Of the darkness that had existed beneath their home for her entire life, in a strange way, that knowledge felt like absolution. Now, Marcus said, watching the last of the evidence bags being loaded into the coroner's van, I think I'm going to plant a garden. Danny looked at him like he'd lost his mind. A garden? In the middle of a crime scene? Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed since Jessica's funeral. Karen always complained that my landscaping wasn't up to community standards. I think it's time I proved her wrong. As the floodlights illuminated the chaos of his backyard, Marcus could already see it. Flowers where the pool had been, vegetables where Tommy Valdez had been buried, life growing from the earth where death had been hidden for 20 years. It wouldn't bring Jessica back, and it wouldn't erase the horror of what had been discovered. But it would be something new, so